Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. We're all here to talk about the challenges of reconstruction toward a new balance in the Middle East. And I think before we begin, I want to introduce a very qualified panel who will have a chance to weigh in on the topic. And I'm going to say a few remarks, and then I'm going to kick it off with Tobias. Tobias Ellwood is the former foreign minister for the Middle East for various different PMs, quite a few. So he's well qualified to talk about Middle East politics. Baghdad Amriev is the president of the Turkic Investment Fund, and he's also formerly been an ambassador to a number of the Middle Eastern countries, so he has some expertise in that. Karen von Hippel is the chairman of the Defense and Securities for Ardent Strategies, if I've got that right. And to her left, Jonathan Panikov is the director of the Scowcroft Middle East Securities Initiative and also of the Atlantic Council. And finally, to his left, we have Andrew Gilmore, who is the former UN Secretary General for Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, if I've got that right. Let's start just by saying that the topic here, the challenges of reconstruction, let's talk about reconstruction both in the physical sense of rebuilding, which is top of mind in places like Syria, Gaza, southern Lebanon, Yemen, various other places, and also as a metaphor, because there will be a restructuring of the Middle East politically and socially probably in the next couple of years. So we'll be talking about both of those. Let's start with Tobias. Give us the lay of the land on the Middle East now. How did we get here?
Well, Charles, thank you very much indeed. It's a real pleasure to be on such a distinguished panel. And yes, I think that's important to place perhaps the Middle East and the journey that it's been on over the last 3 decades or so in perspective, because you speak about conflict and reconstruction normally happens after the conflict or the challenges or the instability has concluded. And I would argue that we're still actually a long way from that point. And it's critical to understand or remind ourselves, because I'm sure the audience will be fully aware of some of the turning points that we've had in the Middle East the last couple of decades, which have seen the rise of other stakeholders and the demise of the previous stakeholders. Russia, for example, the House of Assad, completely different scenario now in Syria. America, after what happened in 2003 in Iraq, has seen them not just dial back in the Middle East, but actually take a more isolationist approach to intervention across the world. In Iran, its proxy influence has changed completely with the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and we're aware of that. But even going back to the Arab Spring as well, the impact of that on Egypt, that toyed with the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood and then resorted back to having a very strong autocratic leader, now concerned about what might happen with the spillover of Hamas in the Middle East. Syria is particularly interesting because the rise of the advance of Al-Qaeda into ISIS and then the creation of this caliphate. And now we see Ahmed al-Shura, who was once leading HTS, now being courted by the international community and brought into perhaps being seen as the future for Syria. So placing this into context is very, very important indeed. My message when stitching all this together is that we are in a continued phase of flux, that we're not yet ready to do that reconstruction much as we'd like to, because the politics in Lebanon, the politics in Yemen, the politics in Syria, certainly the politics in Iraq and indeed elsewhere and in Iran have yet to be sorted. Those are the questions that perhaps we'll dive into further in our discussions today, but they're all interlinked to make the world, I'm afraid, particularly the Middle East, more unstable, and a hesitance of the traditional stakeholders, particularly Russia and America, to participate in any desire to take it into a better place.
I'd like to pick up on that flux comment because that raises the question of whether or not any of the reconstruction that we're talking about can take place without political settlements, without political arrangements being changed. Who at the far end of our panel would like to, you're nodding your head, Karen.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today and with this amazing panel to talk about this incredible challenge. So yes, of course, we need political reconciliation. We need, which we don't have in a number of places, as everyone knows. But then I think another thing we all need to be thinking about when we get to the reconstruction or planning for reconstruction, which should be happening even while war is going on. If you follow Ukraine, they do some really incredible thinking about what they want their country to look like already now as they're getting bombed. And I would just mention, two factors that we need to be thinking about. One, of course, is how do you mitigate in the reconstruction for climate change? So part of the Syria civil war, a lot of it started due to shortage of water, climate challenges, and that challenge is only worse now after really the country's been so destroyed. So as we think through the reconstruction for Syria, for Gaza, for other parts of the region, thinking through how can we integrate planning for that kind of mitigation into the plans for reconstruction. And then the second bit, of course, is what you're referring to, Charles, earlier, which is really the security angle. And the region is still riddled with foreign fighters, with former ISIL sleeper cells. The security challenges are going to be enormous going forward. In Syria, al-Shara seems to be integrating some of these foreign fighters into the government. He's trying to demobilize them, but I'm not entirely sure we can be very confident about what happens there. And so I think the plans that are happening, whatever countries are involved, Central Asia, the United States, Canada, European countries, the United Kingdom, what other countries, whatever, of course, in the region as well, really need to be thinking through the security aspect and the climate aspect.
Before we get into the physical aspects of reconstruction, I want to stay on the political for just a second. A year or two ago, if you talked about a two-state solution or you talked about Palestinian statehood, people would roll their eyes and it was kind of dismissed as an irrelevant topic and never going to happen. And now it seems, through the war in Gaza, it has been rehabilitated as a major political issue. Is there a possibility of reconstruction in the region without a Palestinian statehood, at least a move in that direction? Jonathan?
Sure. I think there's some reconstruction that can happen. I think certainly in Syria and Lebanon are not predicated on a two-state solution. Eventually, if you get to reconstruction in Yemen, if you actually get a settlement there, the same is true as well. I think in Gaza, the challenge that's so different from the others is fundamentally the view is, understandably so, the GCC countries who are committing the most, particularly Qatar, and the UAE and Saudi Arabia to reconstruction in theory, as Trump would like, for instance, are sick and tired of continuing to put money in only for Israel to then keep blowing it up. And so it's created a very challenging dynamic. But even before you get to reconstruction, when you talk to humanitarian experts, it's going to take 2 full years from now, if the war were to stop today, for Gazan rubble to be cleared, for enough humanitarian aid to flow in, that you could even begin reconstruction. And so it's actually quite a long pathway and quite a long buildup. And I think the question is, within that interceding time of those 2 years in Gaza, is there a political development that's actually helpful, or do you have continued slide back on issues related to a two-state solution? For all the goals, and especially many in Europe and many throughout Europe who have now pushed or recognized Palestine, pushed for a Palestinian state, the reality is we are further from a two-state solution in the traditional framing of it than we ever have been since the time of Madrid. And Oslo right after that. So I think we have quite a bit to go. And all of this, though, requires to even have this conversation, both political changes, not only in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority, but it's going to require a level of security so that even new Israeli and Palestinian administrations view their territories as fundamentally secure, that they'd even be willing to consider this. Right now, we're pretty far away from this, no matter how much Arab states, Europeans, others want that to be the driver.
Tobias.
A very short introduction here is on the two-state solution. I think that is an example of where the church elders, if you like, the wise owls, the international community itself has lost its passion, its desire, its ability to influence what's going on in the Middle East. And it's given free rein to any stakeholder, in this case Israel, or can I specifically say Netanyahu, to pursue agendas which perhaps in a different world would have been checked. And sadly, what we're seeing now, the destruction of Gaza, with I think a desire, long-term desire to actually take over Gaza, the announcement of new settlements in the West Bank and so forth. This is taking us further away, but all happening simply because there is no collective wisdom, international wisdom to challenge this. What Turkey is doing as well, perhaps for its own benefits, its own reasons, its own justification, in Syria is another example of that. That's why I'm saying there's a very dangerous place of flux that we're going into with conflicting agendas, which I'm afraid could lead to further instability down the line.
Our topic is reconstruction, and clearly the Gulf states are going to play a big part in that because they've got the resources, they've got the money, and they're going to be tapped by the global powers to try to contribute to reconstruction. But now we are seeing political caveats from the Gulf states, and particularly, for example, the Abraham Accords, which were a great achievement by President Trump in his first term, and looked to be a model for expanding cooperation between Arab states and Israel. And now, of course, since Gaza, that seems to have changed as well. Would anybody like to comment on the future of the Abraham Accords before we get into reconstruction per se?
Well, not so much the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords so manifestly exclude the Palestinians. I agree with everything Jonathan said, by the way, and also Tobias in his last points about that fundamental issue. Because agreeing with totally as I did with Jonathan, I would go perhaps a little bit further. I believe that there's no point even talking about the cement and the vast amounts of Gulf funding that they are expected to put in. Before we get to that, there needs to be some sort of reconstruction of the Israeli mentality. I mean, in 1956, so 70 years ago, the great UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld wrote to his friend David Ben-Gurion, the founding father of Israel, and said, "You believe that hitting Gaza all the time is somehow going to stop the Gazans making their provocations. I tell you, it means that they will continue. You think that doing this will also lead to greater recognition of Israel in the Arab world. I tell you, it will do the opposite." Now, that has been essentially the UN's line for the last 70 years, but it is, and the Israeli line has also not changed, except it's got a lot worse. Last week, there was an opinion poll by Penn State University that said that 47% of the Israeli public would like to see every single Gazan killed, and 82% would like to see every single Gazan expelled, forcibly expelled, which would be a massive war crime. While this is going on, and as Jonathan pointed out, while everybody knows that if they then invest, and the EU have had this repeatedly in the West Bank, that their development projects in the West Bank have been very, very deliberately and systematically destroyed by the Israelis in order to prevent the development and let alone the reconstruction of Gaza. So while that's going on, I really don't see much chance of even talking about reconstruction. When it comes to Syria, I'd like to make another point, but after back to you.
I'm glad you ended on Syria, because that would seem to be the place where reconstruction would commence before any other place. As there's a new government and they are gaining recognition by the West, who's going to pay for Syria? And who's going to actually undertake reconstruction? Because the destruction is vast and the political situation is still a little bit chaotic. So who's going to pay for that? And who's going to undertake the actual heavy lifting on reconstructing Syria? Who wants to take that? Andrew?
Well, yeah, sorry. But President Trump did a remarkable thing. He often does remarkable things, but what was remarkable about this one is that it was remarkably good, and it was suspending sanctions on Syria. Without that, there was no chance of reconstruction. And with it, there is some hope that the businesses can reinvest in there, which they've hesitated about doing. Unfortunately, they've only been waived or suspended. They haven't been cancelled. So for long-term business propositions, they will need to be erased altogether. But that is a very positive start. But what is crucial, because we've seen reconstruction elsewhere in the world, but let us just stick to the neighborhood. We've seen Iraq after the US invasion, Lebanon after the Civil War. Immense corruption accompanies reconstruction. So we need some form of democratization and transparency and accountability as well. And that is so easily put to one side. And if we don't have that, if we don't have some form of transitional justice, the massive crimes of the Assad regime that are so vast and have been going on since well before 1982, the big massacre of Hama. But nevertheless, so we have to have some of those human reconstruction before to accompany rather the physical reconstruction. But in terms of the payment, at least if businesses could be encouraged to go in again, you wouldn't need quite so much vast amounts coming in from the Gulf.
Yes, Jonathan.
I just want to add kind of 2 points here. One is that I think the point Andrew makes on the business side is critically important. And the long-term look, the restrictions of the Caesar Act are still in place. As he said, they've been suspended. You're going to have to repeal that through the U.S. Congress. I think getting rid of U.S. terrorism designations, because HTS is still designated as a U.S. terrorist organization, is going to be important. I think getting Syria access to the SWIFT system, the international banking system, is going to be critically important. There are a number of steps that can be taken right now that don't actually require a huge amount of effort, but would have big impact on the ground in terms of potential investment in Syria. No private sector company is going to invest unless they actually are comfortable that the investment is going to last beyond the 6 months that the waiver itself lasts. The second thing is, to the Gulf states, I want to put out a slightly different thought here, which is, I think it's very dangerous to view the Gulf states as the automatic piggy bank right now for reconstruction around the region. There's reconstruction in Lebanon, reconstruction in Syria, future reconstruction in Gaza, potentially in parts of the West Bank, reconstruction in Yemen. The bank is closed, except for the Qataris, who will provide some. The Emiratis and the Saudis especially, and I'll come back to the Saudis in a second, they're done. We've seen how the Emiratis have approached this, right? We've seen what they've done with the Egyptians in terms of investment. They're willing to invest, and I think that is going to continue. But they're not willing to keep giving the free handouts. They feel like they've been burned over and over and over again for decades. And so that means you're talking about potentially more demands, more restrictions, and that's going to cause a little bit more of a challenge than we've seen for some of this massive reconstruction. And for the Saudis specifically, it's really, really important. The Crown Prince's goal and sole goal right now is to fundamentally diversify the Saudi economy away from hydrocarbons. It is a struggle right now. Oil prices aren't close to where they need to be for him to be able to do this. He's struggling to be able to do this. So the idea of giving money away at a time of real risk is just not something that he wants to do. And so I think that's going to play in as well to how Saudi approaches this issue.
You anticipated my next question with that.
You're welcome or sorry.
The reflex line is always, well, the Gulf states will pay for it. They've got the money. They're going to pay for it. But the question, I think, is what role will the big powers play? What's the United States going to do? What's Russia going to do? What kind of reconstruction effort and financing can we expect from the major powers? Who wants to grab that? Baghdad?
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in this very interesting discussion.
There you go.
That's a distinct pleasure to participate in this very interesting panel session. Middle East has always been at the heart of the world politics, the attention of all the political communities all around the world, all the time, for the very long time. Once we counted more than 50% of all the agenda items of the General Assembly of the United Nations and Security Council of United Nations for decades has been the problems of Middle East, and the situation is continuing to attract attention of all the world. So, regarding the positions of great powers, you asked, this region has always been conservative. Also, position of old world powers have always been very conservative, unchangeable for a long time. Everybody knew that. We know the policy of the United Nations toward the Middle East and settlement of Middle Eastern problems. We have also been aware of the policy of the Soviet Union, then Russia, and Europe, and other countries. And the world has been waiting for good news from the Middle East for a long time. But still, we are in this position. But I think that it will happen. We will hear good news from the Middle East. For this to happen, policies of great power should be changed. We are witnessing this also policies of the United States and Russia. So political settlement of the Middle East as a whole, and particular Middle Eastern problems should open the door for the reconstruction we are talking about, and reconciliation of the Middle Eastern countries, especially settlement, political settlement between Israel and Arab countries. So first, policies of the world power should be changed. Otherwise, it will be very difficult for Middle Eastern countries themselves to settle their problems. So if political settlement is there will be new chances, new opportunities for the Middle East, for reconstruction, especially now we are witnessing that Middle East is experiencing generational change as well. New leaders are coming, and it gives us hope.
Karen.
Thank you. I wanted to just build on something what Andrew mentioned earlier in terms of reconstruction in Syria. I think I'm a little bit less worried about the money than maybe you guys are, because there are a number of wealthy Syrians. There are a lot of people who want to invest in Syria and help. It's a huge challenge, I get it, and the place has been, so much of the country has been destroyed. But the bigger concern is what Andrew touched on earlier, is making sure that the money goes to the right place, coming up with some good transparency, anti-corruption measures early on, coordinating all the money. You have a very weak government that doesn't really control most of the territory, and sometimes they get overwhelmed, and we've seen this in other places. I remember in Lebanon, after it was 2007, the bombing campaign that Israel conducted against Hezbollah, there were so many different funders coming in, and it wasn't very coordinated. The UN was doing one thing, but all these Arab states were adopting villages, Lebanese charities were funding things, and it just wasn't being brought together at all. And so that's really a concern, especially when you get countries like China will be wanting to participate, and others that just do things in a very different way. And so I think, the international community, hopefully the UN and others, will be working very closely with the Syrians to make sure they are actually leading the reconstruction and not getting overwhelmed by all these people coming, wanting to help.
I think you've raised a very important question. I think reconstruction has to benefit, we'd all agree, has to benefit the people and not necessarily the elites and the already wealthy in these countries. And we can pick that up in a second, but you had an intervention on this, Tobias.
Yes, I did. I mean, following on from Karen, I mean, when you talk about Syria, who are the Syrians? And you have an interim president right now. Does he represent all of Syria? You've got Arabs and Kurds, you've got Druze, Alawites, you've got Sunnis and Shia. You've got those stakeholders, the investors, potential donors, will all be looking to support their particular aspects and their the diasporas or the people that they have a connection with. And my concern is that there hasn't been a recognition of what would be the ultimate satisfactory governance structure, because the new president has excluded many of these sectarian groups from this council, this transition council. The next elections, I stand corrected, but I think are quite a long way down the road. They're, I think, 3 or 4 years away. Much can happen there. Turkey is taking full advantage of that. It now runs Aleppo. It provides, I think, the electricity for the city, and it's expanding its sphere of influence in the north. Israel is doing its thing and actually taking out dangerous Syrian assets elsewhere. And my question to the international community is, should we not be doing more to actually invest in supporting a governance structure that will survive? Otherwise, I fear history will repeat itself, because no individual sectarian group has the power enough to actually command or the authority to control the rest of the country. It's too complicated. That's my concern here. That's what I think the international community should be encouraging to do. Have a solution that brings together all the groupings and a governance structure that allocates out power on a more local basis. The Kurds certainly want that in their neck of the woods, but that itself is complicated. We can't gloss over these issues, otherwise war, conflict will return.
Well, talking about the great powers intervening and trying to stabilize here, the great powers themselves are almost as divided as the local population in Syria. What's happened in Syria has disadvantaged Russia, for example. They may not be entirely happy about that for the long term. So I don't know how the great powers could intervene in such a way as to actually stabilize Syria. If anybody has a great idea on that, it would be welcome.
Just one quick point on the Russia factor. I mean, I think a number of Syrians won't be very happy for Russia to be very involved, because they all remember Russia supporting the Assad regime, bombing civilians with chlorine bombs and chemical weapons, etc. So I think the Russians aren't going to be very popular for the immediate future.
But the sanctions, if I could say, the sanctions, Trump is just, I think, reducing sanctions, but I don't think there are many conditions placed on this. So to nudge the leader, that's the concern I have, is that the fact that the leader is deaf to some of the sectarian concerns that are already being expressed. And that's where, you're right, which stakeholder, which big country wants to then get involved? This is, they'll want to keep their fingers away from it. I just fear that in this world now, where we've become more isolated, less interested in perhaps looking at solutions, tricky solutions, no doubt about it, we're actually storing up problems for the future. Sudan is another great example, where we're not participating at all in trying to reconcile that. Iran, Lebanon, Yemen, these are all things where they require some cognitive thinking, some statecraft. We're not seeing that on the global stage anymore.
We've got 2 comments at the end, yeah. Andrew.
Well, that's exactly, Tobias's point, I totally agree with. I mean, with everybody's conflicting agendas, and there have always been so many. I mean, let's face it, we're talking about the Russian bases. Who lobbied the Americans to allow the Russian bases to stay? Who lobbied the Americans to not lift sanctions? The Israelis. And so they have a strong vested interest, as they see it, in not having a government led by Shara or a democratic government. And in that last point, I fear he may be in agreement with several Arab states who don't want to see a successful democratic experiment in an Arab country. So, I mean, there are the Turks, which have been mentioned. And who is going to pull this all together? And that is and I don't have an answer, because it's not really the Europeans' job, and they wouldn't be up to it anyway. And the Americans, if they did it, would do it wrong. And so I don't know who it's going to be. Yeah.
Jonathan, do you have an idea?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Oh, thanks. And just try to block me out. So I actually slightly dissent from this line because I think it's a little bit broader, and I slightly have a different view here than what Andrew just put out. I think, look, I certainly agree the Israelis are making a mistake here. I also disagree with some of the Gaza stuff too, but we can come back to that. I disagree. I think the Israelis certainly are making a mistake. The idea of trying to keep everybody weak has never worked before in almost any country. In the end, inevitably, somebody emerges, and not choosing isn't of itself a choice. You got to choose who it is, even if it's the least bad, and I am among those. I think Shara is the least bad option. That's what we should go with at the moment. But I think, Charles, to your broader point, there's a broader competition going on here that isn't reflected in Gaza or really Yemen or even Lebanon that is about the global powers and what that looks like vis-a-vis Syria. There are significant interests in Syria because of the location, and that's being filtered down now in a way that we always think of it through U.S., China, Russia lens. China clearly wants to invest in Syria. That's where its interests are. The Chinese have actually disappointed a lot of people over the last 18 months. That there's a lot of folks within the Arab world that thought that they would become much more aggressive and actually get involved and prove their worth and do something beyond investments on the security side related to everything going on in the Straits and through the Suez. And what happened? Well, China was nowhere to be found. They cut their own deal and they moved on. I think we've seen what happens with Chinese investment in Africa, where there's a lot of countries that took it for years and now have said, well, what did we get for this? We were strip mined, things are falling apart, it's not being successful. I think that is a concern I'm already hearing about. If it's Chinese-led investment in Syria, will they really be there for the long term? Are they going to be there? And does Syria have the capacity or the leverage to actually compel China? On Russia, I completely agree with Karen. I think it's a problem. And for the U.S., I apologize in advance. Look, I think President Trump fundamentally does not want to be involved in the region. He doesn't. I think there may be a necessity to be involved more than some of his folks would want, but he really wants to make investments. And if there's a meaningful investment he can make in Syria, then he'll do it. But I think it's quite telling. He's already talking very explicitly that U.S. troops are going to come out of Syria in the near future. That causes all sorts of problems in the Northeast for the potential resurgence of ISIS. And we talk about how do you build an economy without security? You cannot. And if you can't build that economy without security because ISIS is now coming down and attacking, then it's going to create a situation of fragmentation in which the Turks are going to say, we have to protect the North, and this is the great excuse to do it. And President Trump has already been clear, he's going to let them do that. I think the Israelis have actually, believe it or not, moved back from where they were. They're not going to give the high ground back. I would not either if I were the Israelis. But I do worry that we are going toward a more fragmented position akin to where Tobias was indicating. But I'm not sure the difference in my estimation is the will. I don't think there's a willingness of any of the major powers or any of the intermediate powers, including Turkey or Saudi or the Gulf countries, to actually play that role. And so what you're really doing is relying on a hope that the initial investments, the initial support of Shara is enough to get you over the initial hump. I think we're going to have to wait and see, but I'm skeptical, unfortunately.
I want to do a best case, worst case scenario question, I guess, for the group. Let's say best case, the crisis in Gaza is resolved. Netanyahu is deposed, maybe, I don't know, one way or another. He loses an election, he's out. Let's say that the Saudis say that they will, entertain rapprochement with Israel if there is a movement toward a Palestinian state, and then there is, and all of that is a best case scenario. And let's look at the worst case scenario. I would say Israel attacks nuclear facilities in Iran, and that triggers a major conflagration in the whole region, including, as Sheikh Mohammed in Qatar has pointed out, contamination of the Persian Gulf, which would be a catastrophe, ecological catastrophe. We've been very negative about the prospects for the Middle East. Let's entertain the idea that there is a possible solution in Gaza, that it could trigger other positive developments. And then we're actually looking at physical reconstruction. At that point, who steps up in the region and who steps up globally to actually affect that reconstruction? Who wants to take that big picture question?
I'll take the Iran dimension because, and I'm conscious that Jonathan who's representing Donald Trump here this afternoon, might disagree. But I do think that Donald Trump himself has an issue with Iran that he wants to resolve completely during his next couple of years. You suggested that Israel may attack. I see Donald Trump forcing Iran to the table to sign some form of long-term security deal on nuclear. And if he doesn't get all his terms, then it'll be America that decisively, kinetically, gets itself involved in a short-term event with Iran, which will lead, in their minds, to regime change, concluding the humiliation that goes back to the 444 days that hostages were held and so forth, the decades of proxy influence and so on. That'll be Trump's legacy. I think that is a dimension that will have rippling impacts right across the Middle East. You focused on Gaza. That's the bit I fear for the most, because the one influencer, the one stakeholder that could nudge Netanyahu if he remains in power, and I think Jonathan mentioned this, that if your objective is constant war, is through fear, but no strategy to show how your battlefield success turns itself into a political strategy, which is what he's doing, then that's where it goes. So Donald Trump has no interest in checking at the moment, maybe it changed, Netanyahu's behavior, and that's taking us further away from a two-state solution. Were that to unwind, I actually do believe, I'm optimist to say money would come forward, the international community, to rebuild Gaza, to rebuild. The World Bank is actually doing studies now. Karen's point, it's actually happening quietly behind the scenes. How do you rebuild Gaza? So you're not then having to do the paperwork, the details, once the guns fall silent. But that requires, as I say, huge pressure, a seismic change of political attitude by Israel, probably the removal, some way or another, of Netanyahu.
I think the Riviera on the Middle East is probably not going to happen, but Karen, what do you think?
Just want to follow on. Do you mind pushing your red buttons? Some of you, yeah, thank you.
Power here, isn't there, when you keep it on?
I know this is a zero-sum game up here, but just two quick points following what Tobias said, and also what Tobias said at the start. I mean, it's very interesting, even setting Gaza aside, which is still this incredible tragedy. What it has triggered, though, and the successes Israel has had in weakening all of Iran's proxies in the region, almost all of them anyway. So Hezbollah, the Houthis still to a degree, but certainly inside Syria, it's really fundamentally changed the geopolitics of that region. And so it has put Iran in a much weaker place than it has been in some time. And so I see that as an opportunity, as Tobias is also saying. It's an opportunity for Iran to be engaged in a very different way, and I do think they'll be pushed to the negotiating table. I don't think Donald Trump wants another war as much as he likes to threaten countries. He also doesn't like war. He sees that as bad for business. So I'm slightly more optimistic, actually, about Iran. On Syria, I used to work on Syria for the State Department in the early days of the revolution when it was still nonviolent, and our envoy, the American ambassador at the time, Robert Ford, used to say, in Syria, it'll get worse before it gets worse. And we did see that. It just successively got worse. So in a sense, it's not even worse. It's always good to plan for worst-case scenarios, but actually, we've seen it. And let's also not forget about Libya, too, by the way. I mean, that's, on the edge of this whole region, but it's also, not looking very positive as well right now.
Can I just make one point? Because I completely agree with everything Karen and Tobias what you said. The region changes quicker than maybe any other region in the world. And I know that seems cliche, but I would just point this out. There was a picture taken of Shara, MBS, and Trump when he was there a couple weeks ago. It literally wasn't that long ago, just over a decade ago, that picture people would have thought was a Saturday Night Live joke or a comedy sketch joke. Shara was an al-Qaeda leader, MBS was a unknown nephew of the Saudi king that nobody could name or think of. And Donald Trump was getting to the end of the run of The Apprentice and trying to figure out desperately how to keep his name in the papers. I think the region changes quick, and so I'm actually a little more optimistic as well. I think on Iran, the question is going to be enrichment, and can you creatively figure out a way through something, a consortium in Iran, something else, to allow the Iranians to enrich because they're not going to get off of that red line. But I think that there is a huge opportunity here, in part because of Israel's successes, as Karen said. The problem is we also know it can go south very, very quickly as well. And so if you don't keep investing in the Middle East, and this is the challenge on the U.S. side, then it will slip away. That's the only thing that we know for sure. There's no choice. Either you keep pushing forward or it'll go on its own destiny. It's not going to be one that's positive for any of us.
Tobias.
I just wanted to correct the record and confirm that Jonathan doesn't represent Donald Trump. I'm sorry you didn't push back on that, which now makes you wonder whether you do actually. But certainly, you're the American on the panel, so it's important to get that perspective.
It's okay. I just took it as a wonky British anachronism, and So.
I'd like to allow a few minutes for questions from the audience. If you have any questions and you'd like to raise your hand, we'll entertain some questions. Yeah, sure. I think they're running to give you a mic. It's on its way.
Thank you. Lizzie Porter, the National newspaper. I'm Turkey correspondent, but I cover Syria, Iran, and the Middle East. I have a question for Tobias. I saw on your X feed that you said the UK should do food drops into Gaza via the RAF. Given we know that such food drops are of limited effectiveness and that potentially Israel is more motivated by threats of stopping trade over the war in Gaza, would you support the UK government going further than it already has in suspending trade talks and potentially cutting off existing trade with Israel?
Thank you for the question. It's not symbolic, the food drops. I've been involved in the army in food drops. They can have an impact. It depends on the scale of it. Let's go extreme. The Berlin airlift, it actually pushed the Soviet Union back. It's an indication of the international community saying we will not tolerate what's going on. And that was my message in my tweet, is to say how appalled I am personally that we're not doing this. And Britain is a country that does step forward, perhaps when others hesitate, to say the things that need to be said, even if it's of an ally such as this, that what we're seeing in Gaza is unacceptable. Whether it's airdrops or whether we do upgrade the capability of having our own maritime landing platform to bring aid in, it's a message to Israel that should change. And yes, that's your second question, is that we should look for other avenues to place pressure on Israel. It goes back to my point, is that there's an absence of the international community working together to place pressure on a country that, errant nations that act in this way. And it's very sad to see, and it's not just Israel, but other countries around the world are taking advantage of the fact that it's becoming easier and easier to push your own authoritarian or your own individual agenda, nationalistic agenda, knowing that nobody will check you.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes. Microphone coming.
I'm from local think tank institute. So my question is about what's the global powers master plan for the Gaza issue? So what we are hearing now, witnessing, it's just waiting to stop this genocide. But in fact, there are no action taken. And why I'm putting this question, because it is significant if we take into consideration the forthcoming event on June. I'm not sure what's exactly, but something like to recognize from the global powers to stop this or recognize Palestine or something like that. You can correct me if I'm mistaken, but what's your master plan for Israel government actions and policy? Because the whole world just witnessing, and what we have, it's just a voicing and some promotion. It's a voice, but no action to be taken. Thank you.
Everybody's looking at everybody else to take that. Anybody have any bright ideas for Gaza that are not currently being circulated and being considered?
I'll give it a pop if nobody else is saying anything. Firstly is the desire, the appetite to act. We've had President Kagame here yesterday speaking about what happened in his country. You know, there is now a collective duty of the international community to step in, a duty to act when we see wrong on such a scale. So that's the first step. The second step is, you're quite right to ask, how in practical terms would that operate? Bearing in mind the atrocities that Hamas conducted on that 7th of October, the barbaric actions, and the fact they still have hostages there as well. Perhaps it's too simplistic to look at Northern Ireland, the model there, where I served. I was up against the IRA. And now you have Sinn Féin, that is a political wing of the old IRA, and how they've advanced. So Hamas is representing the Palestinians. Could it be that something from the West Bank could come across and provide that governance direction? But at the moment, we're not even having these conversations about what might be the successor of Hamas. How do you get Hamas itself to rewrite its own constitution that says it doesn't want to see the removal of Israel as a state? Very, very difficult questions to answer. But when you have an Al-Qaeda affiliate now getting sanctions relief from an American president in Syria, then these are the difficult questions that need to be explored to say, what is the political journey that those in Gaza and indeed the West Bank need to go on to gain great acceptance, to earn the right to govern themselves peacefully?
Andrew.
Yeah, your question is very good. I don't have an answer for yours, Charles, as to what do I have a new bright idea. The bright idea is to follow international law and to have a vaguely consistent approach towards it. I would say it ranks as perhaps the worst event of my lifetime, what we are seeing at the moment. Yes, more terrible things have happened, for example, the Rwanda genocide, but you didn't get large numbers of democratic governments giving essentially a blank check to the perpetrators. What has been going on in the last year, 18 months, will never be forgotten. And Tobias is quite right to raise the terrible atrocity that Hamas committed in October that started the latest round of what has been an 80-year-old conflict. But what has been going on, I mean, and there's been a slight change in the last 2 or 3 months, I would say, as people who have hitherto provided total moral and political support to the Israelis have started to step back. But it's taken a very, very long time, and the rest of the world, particularly the Muslim world, is not going to forget this. And I'm very conscious of this, and I fear that the continent, Europe, who are not the main players here, but they have their fine words about rule of law, human rights, democracy, are going to be held up and regarded as pretty worthless as a result of this.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm from Toyota Corporation, Middle East and the Central Asia representatives, and I'm in charge of this area. And then I would like to have about Iran's very, very bright scenario. Everything, U.S. government will convince the government in Iran, and then Iran will be, if normalized, what's going on in the Middle East? Because I think Israel doesn't want Iran to be back to the normal, and also the other GCC country also is not so happy if Iran will be normalized. But for the Central Asia, Iran is a very, very important geographic countries because especially in Kazakhstan, can access to the sea very easy. So how do you think if the Iran will be completely normalized, what's going on in this world?
So what's going on in Iran? Jonathan.
First, let me maybe start from the back. There is no scenario I can envision in which the U.S. is going to normalize relations with Iran under the current structure that Iran exists with its supreme leader in place. It's just not going to happen. The political risk of doing so would just be almost existential for the Trump administration. It's not going to happen. If you can move forward, then that means can you get a nuclear deal that actually keeps things calm in the region. And you're absolutely right to point out that the GCC states, ironically, from where we were 10 years ago, where Saudi Arabia and the Emirates were the biggest proponents of the maximum pressure campaign, have now completely inverted. And the reason they've inverted is because they don't have confidence. Plan A was that the U.S. would serve as a security umbrella and there would be defense pacts and it would be very, very tight, and they don't have confidence in that. So if you don't have confidence in that, and going back to an earlier point I made, in your Saudi Arabia, and your fundamental and almost sole goal is to diversify your economy, there's not enough political risk insurance in the world to ensure FDI continues if you have Houthi or Iranian missiles raining down on your country. As a result, it requires you to take option B of détente and rapprochement, and that's what we're seeing. And so I think, look, at the end of the day, a deal with Iran is probably going to come down to enrichment. My sense is it'll be very similar to JCPOA. It's not going to be an actual complete deal first. You're probably looking at a framework deal first. And it is going to drive the Israelis especially out of their minds. The debate going on right now is whether or not Israel would strike Iran anyways and the nuclear sites anyways without the U.S. I am quite skeptical of that. Maybe under the Biden administration. I doubt that they will do it with the Trump administration. I absolutely could be wrong. But the problem is, what are you actually succeeding in doing? All of the Arab relationships that you have, that you've built, including with the UAE and the quiet ones that still continue with Saudi Arabia, will be greatly diminished if the Israelis do that. Your relationship with the U.S. will be greatly diminished if you do that. Your relationship with the Europeans, who, by the way, are actually in the E3 being a little more forward-leaning than the U.S. On the Iran issue, will be greatly diminished. So I don't think there's going to be an opening. I wouldn't expect huge opportunities, but that doesn't mean that you won't see some sanctions relief. But the question is, you're still going to be around the margins, right? Iran probably is not going to be let back into the SWIFT system. And so that's going to cause huge challenges for engagement.
Tobias.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, it's worth mentioning what's actually happening in Iran as well. I've been there a couple of times, not too long ago, the last couple of years. You can feel a sense of frustration by the people of Iran, and occasionally that spills out. And when it spills out onto the streets and the demonstrations, the hijab incident was one, the pushback against the religious police, the frustration with the economy itself, and indeed with the regime. Internally, I think it's starting to boil up, and that is something that's being noticed. And each time the people come out to demonstrate, they're a little bit more confident than the time before. And maybe I'm being optimistic here, but I feel that the sell-by date of this old, very religious Orthodox regime is coming towards the end, which is why a nudge from the outside could tip it over. It could tip it over. And that's the big question now, is whether you take advantage of the fact that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis are much more diminished in power. The proxy influence of Iran is down. Do you now go for the full regime change to try and get a more democratic and accountable Iran that you could argue the younger generation Iranians would now like to see develop?
I'm going to interpret that as an optimistic take on the region that we can end this panel on. I would like to thank our panelists. They were experts and they delivered a lot on this. We could have talked for another couple of hours. The Middle East is a complicated subject, but great panel. Thank you very much.